So Harpreet and Heidi, why don't you start us off? What were the key themes from session 1?
Great, thank you. I will go ahead and present our key themes on behalf of myself, Dr. Singh, and our panelists. So we'll start with the issues that were covered during session 1. Trials are not designed to enroll older adults. Sponsors are not incentivized to enroll representative older adults. Older adults are not routinely engaged in trial design and education. Importantly, education regarding the value of trials for older adults has been lacking. We had a robust discussion about the issues related to access to trials being consistent barriers to accruing older adults. And this includes geography, community settings, availability and obstacles in both the rural and urban setting, cost, and in particular, transportation. We discussed the issue of eligibility criteria, which continue to be pervasive and limit enrollment for older adults. Vulnerable and frail older adults are not studied, and yet they are treated routinely in practice. We talked about providers' reluctance to enroll older adults on trials for some of the reasons that we've just addressed above. And then finally, and importantly, geriatric measures are not routinely captured in clinical trials. Next slide. So on this slide and the following slide, we'll talk about some of the solutions that were proposed during this session. The first is to require early collaboration in trial design with older adult patients and older adult patient advocates. It is critically important that we include the perspective of older adults throughout the design and conduct of clinical trials. Another is to develop and disseminate education tools in collaboration with senior advocates to really begin to promote the value of enrolling on clinical trials to our older adult population. It's also important that we enhance the reporting requirements from clinical trials, both for providers, for patients, and the public. And one example that has been previously mentioned relates to journal reporting. So it should no longer be acceptable to simply report the age of patients on a clinical trial by 65 and above or below, but rather enhanced journal reporting should be required with broadened age categories, as well as a requirement to provide data for those older adults who are enrolled on any practice-changing trial. And we could propose that the ASCO journals take this on in a leadership role and demonstrate to the field how this can be done. We talked about requiring implementation of the modernized eligibility criteria as standard, including the new performance status recommendations, which will be published soon and specifically recommend increasing enrollment routinely to those performance status 2 populations. And so this would include both NCI protocols and in the conduct of an FDA review. And specifically, in doing so, should require a data-driven justification for restriction. So it should no longer be okay to say, well, we don't have data for older patients, and therefore that's a justification for restricting our criteria, but rather emphasizing the best practice of collecting data in earlier phase trials to study the safety of any drug or new therapeutic in older adults and in those with multiple chronic conditions. We talked about the conduct and the importance of the conduct of older adult-specific trials with emphasis on minimum effective dosing, treatment tolerance, and geriatric focus endpoints. And this will be discussed in later session feedback as well. And finally, on this slide at least, we talked about the utilization of the inclusion across the lifespan principle to inform a requirement for expansion cohorts or post-marketing commitment from the standpoint of the FDA review. And specifically what this means is ensuring that the study population matches the disease population and using this as a standardized criteria based on the disease setting to help inform a requirement for additional data collection. Next slide. We discussed specifically identifying validated geriatric endpoints, such as the overall treatment utility outcome that was mentioned in one of the prior sessions, that could be used to support new drug indications or labeling. We talked about the importance of utilizing standardized geriatric assessment measures to design trials for vulnerable and frail older adults. And I think this is really important for us to emphasize here. It should no longer be acceptable that patients and providers have no information on tolerability for those of our adults who are most vulnerable and who are least likely to be resilient to adverse events. This population should be a high priority group. And I would advocate that perhaps the NCI could take an initiative here to fund studies in particular that should focus dedicated attention to vulnerable adults through standalone studies or adaptive trial design. We also talked about the importance of incorporating geriatric assessment into older adult specific trials as a standard procedure. But importantly, we also discussed and would continue to promote the importance of developing and promoting a standardized set of core geriatric measures, a minimum data set to include in all treatment trials that enroll older adults. And we've been calling this the Table 1 initiative. So every Table 1 for a new Phase 3 trial that is being published should include more than just the age and performance status for the patients, but at a minimum should include a validated comorbidity measurement and a validated self-report measure. And I would advocate that the NCI here could also take the lead in using and promoting an evidence-based set of minimum data collection to incorporate in protocol templates for older adults and adult trials. We talked about the importance of including geriatric experts and patient advocates in both design of trials and review of trials at all levels. The importance of developing guidance, creating incentives, and building infrastructure to expand access to community sites, and really capitalizing on the momentum around decentralized trials and telemedicine use. And finally, utilizing labeling to incentivize enrollment of older adults and collection of data to describe the population as both a carrot and a stick in this population. So if older adult data exists, that should be in the label to support providers and patients in their discussion about using those drugs. If there is insufficient data in the clinical trial, that should be in the label to say there is insufficient data to support the use, or at least to describe the tolerability and effectiveness in the older adult population. And so with that, I want to thank all the participants in session 1 and thank the attendees for their attention.
Thank you. That is wonderful. It gives us a lot to think about and to talk over during our discussion.